Today, we become legends.
One of the bigger changes that Smite 2 has made compared to its predecessor is the introduction of active items, which can be used by pressing a button or key to activate a certain effect. These can be hard to get used to at first if you're a Smite 1 player, and remembering to use them will take a bit of time, even for veteran players. I remember myself in my first 1 to 2 months playing this game, I would forget to use them all the time, but now I've got a handle on them, and once you get used to using these puppies, they can provide some crazy benefits over standard passive items. There is a limit of 3 active items in one build, but most of the time you won't be reaching that limit outside of the support role, which typically buys way more active items than other roles do. If you're struggling to find use cases for active items or just want to know what they all do and why you might want them, then this video is for you. I'll be explaining what every active does and how to use them effectively, so let's jump in. First up, we have a pretty simple one in Amanita Charm, which comes with health, protections, and health regen, with the active effect creating a mushroom field in a large area that heals allied gods over 5 seconds with a cooldown of 60. This heal is a percent of max HP, so it will heal more to tankier targets, and this item is usually used on supports to heal their team both in and out of fights. It's basically the meditation relic from Smite 1, but on an item with stats. It's not particularly strong at the moment, especially because it's countered by anti-heal, but it is a bit of a mainstay in Assault for obvious reasons. Next up is a pair of active items that essentially do the same thing but mirrored. Avatar's Parachute and Dreamer's Idol are items that are part of the hyper luxury tier of items. Their cost is extremely high at 3700 gold, but the base stats are also extremely high at 100 strength and 140 intelligence respectively, more than any other item in the game can give. Their active effects play into this as they provide a 25% boost to strength and intelligence respectively, as well as displacement immunity and an increased god model size, but this doesn't affect your hitbox size. For those unaware, all knockups, knockbacks, pulls, grabs, and banishes from Smite 1 are all now just displacement, so this effect provides immunity to all of those CCs. This effect lasts for 10 seconds and has a cooldown of 120. These items can be incredibly powerful later into the match, since the boost is percentage based, so the more strength or int you already have, the more valuable these are. The effect lasts quite a while, but usually not the entire length of a fight, so make sure to use them at the right moment before you're going to do big damage to get the most out of them, and maybe even combine them with an already high power build with items like Rod of Tahuti for Dreamer's Idol or Transcendence for Avatar's Parachute. Next up is Bloodbound Book, which comes with intelligence, health, and lifesteal, and the active effect grants you a health shield based on your max health and your intelligence. While the shield holds, you have plus 20% lifesteal, and your lifesteal also heals nearby allied gods. Getting a kill or assist reduces the active cooldown of this effect by 50%, and the cooldown is 140 seconds base. So this item isn't particularly strong at the moment, mainly due to its very long cooldown and intelligence lifesteal items not being great at the moment. The effect itself can be really strong, especially if you snowball several kills or assists to reduce the cooldown, but overall this item isn't great. If you do like the safety of having a big fat shield and are going a more lifesteal oriented intelligence build, then you can certainly give this a try though. Bloodforge is essentially the strength equivalent to Bloodbound Book and works in a similar way. This comes with strength, attack speed, and lifesteal with the same passive effect, but it scales with strength instead of intelligence. This one is still not amazing either, but a little bit better than Book, simply because strength lifesteal is better than intelligence lifesteal at the moment. But if you want a good active item, Circe's Hexstone is it. This comes with health, cooldown rate, and health regen, and the active effect turns you into a boar and charges you forward while CC immune, and you gain protections for the dash. You stop at the first enemy god and knock them up, dealing % current health physical damage. The cooldown of this is only 90 seconds, and this is an absolutely incredible item, one of the best actives in the game at the moment. This is mostly used for tanks to engage, as it can either give a god with low mobility a way into the fight without using blink, or they can give a god with already good mobility even more ways in. It can be used to disengage and keep gods with limited mobility safe as well, such as Ymir, and even provides CC immunity, which can be useful in certain matchups like Ares, as it's on a much lower base cooldown than Beads is. The use cases for this item are nearly endless, and on an only 90-second cooldown is one of the most powerful active items in the game for supports and solo laners, maybe even some bruiser junglers. Next up is Dagger of Frenzy, which comes with strength and attack speed, and the active effect provides bonus basic attack damage and attack speed for your next 5 basic attacks. It's a much smaller effect than something like Circe's Hexstone, but it is also on an absurdly low 15-second cooldown, with an effect that refreshes the cooldown every time you get a god kill. This one was reworked recently, so it's hard to tell exactly how strong it is, but just based on the numbers, it seems pretty good given how ludicrously often it's up. Even without the reset, you can use this item twice per minion wave in the duo lane, which seems like it could really really swing trades dramatically in your favor. Death Metal is up next, which comes with strength, intelligence, and crit chance with an active effect that grants bonus strength, intelligence, and attack speed to all allies around you for 6 seconds with a cooldown of 60. This item isn't particularly strong right now, mainly because crit builds aren't in the meta, but the item itself does seem quite good, giving really good stats with the boost active while also boosting your other allies for objectives or sieging. Crit chance on a hybrid item is a little weird though, since due to basic attacks scaling much more heavily with strength than they do with intelligence, you will generally want crit items with strength only, but I think this one does have some potential due to the AoE nature of the buff. Next up is Eros Bow, which is one of the more weird active items in the game. This comes with intelligence, health, attack speed, and health regen, and the active effect lets you mark an allied god for 10 seconds with a cooldown of 10 seconds, meaning you can permanently have this effect on an ally if you keep on top of it. When you land a basic attack on an enemy, the marked ally heals for 2% of your max health. As I said, this item is a bit weird and it's extremely niche as it's a supportive item that requires you to have high attack speed, something the supports generally don't build. The item is pretty awful in general right now, and I wouldn't recommend building it outside of one specific case, which is Danzaburo. His clones that spawn from his new passive will proc Eros Bow, so if you have a lot of clones spawning, the healing can be pretty insane. Outside of that very niche interaction though, I wouldn't recommend this item for the most part. Eye of Providence is a simple one that comes with both kinds of protections and health, and is one of the few items in the game that has both a passive and an active effect. The passive grants 50 bonus gold for destroying wards, which on top of the usual 50 means you'll get 100 per ward from this, effectively making your sentry wards only cost 20 gold if you destroy a ward with them. The active effect places a ward for free every 60 seconds, and since the wards last 120 seconds, you can always be maxing out your 2 ward cap with this item, which can be very powerful, especially considering the base stats on this item are pretty competitive for the cost. Of course, you'll still need to buy sentry wards, but all your regular wards are free, and your sentries only cost 20 gold if you get an enemy ward with them, so this is great for support's economy. Overall, it's a pretty good item on supports, especially if you forget to buy your wards, but I wouldn't really recommend it in any other role. Eye of the Storm is a very interesting active item, as it is a toggle that can be used whenever you want and as much as you want. It comes with strength, both kinds of protections, and some health. Activating the toggle creates a vortex around you that pulls enemies in at the cost of 3% max health per second. This is dealt as magical damage and can be mitigated by protection, so with a tank build, this is actually dealing way less than 3% max health per second. This is a weird item and doesn't see much use at the moment, but it could be pretty strong in certain niches. I find it quite useful on Sobek, for example, as it keeps people in range of his ultimate when combined with the slow, and also makes his pluck effectively into a knock straight up instead of throwing them because it's done in a vortex. Definitely give the item a try, as it can be really strong in certain scenarios, but at the moment it doesn't see too much use. Next up is Glorious Pridwin, which is essentially an active item version of Pridwin from Smite 1. This comes with both kinds of protections and cooldown rate, with the active effect gaining you a shield based on protections and dealing damage around you based on protections and slowing enemies twice. Once on activation and once again after 5 seconds or when the shield depletes. The shield is pretty strong and the cooldown of this is only 45 seconds, which is really attractive for this item, but ultimately it doesn't see a whole lot of play at the moment due to the weak base stats, but it does see some use in tank builds as the slow can be particularly powerful on such a short cooldown. Helm of Darkness is up next, which is another pretty crazy one. This comes with intelligence and both kinds of protections. The active effect stealths you for 6 seconds on a 90-second cooldown. You also gain the phantom effect for the duration, letting you walk through player-made walls, but the main effect here is the stealth. This is of course a really powerful effect. Anyone who's played against Loki will know that, especially on gods that can find it hard to engage a fight or don't want to use their blink to do so. This item has found great use on Hades, as it has good stats for him and allows him a free way into the enemy backline without using his dash, so he can use it to follow enemies after they jump or dash away from him once he reveals himself. Hades has been the best use of this item so far, but it's pretty effective on many melee tanks that struggle to engage the fight and or have a good instant impact ability that they can use from stealth that will either CC or do big damage. Cabrakan will also likely be an amazing user of this item once he launches, but he's not quite out yet as of writing this video. Being able to stealth into range for his stun lock combo from his 1-2 will almost certainly be good. Next up is Hide of the Nemean Lion, which works very similar to Smite 1, except the active effect makes the reflect stronger. This comes with physical protections, health, and health regen, with a passive that reflects 15% of basic attack damage taken back to the attacker as physical damage. Activating the item increases the reflect to 30% for 3 seconds on a 120-second cooldown. Nemean is pretty terrible at the moment, unfortunately, and the fact that the active effect only lasts 3 seconds makes it very hard to use, especially with such a long cooldown. The meta builds for ADCs right now are also very heavy into on-hit effects for their damage rather than raw basic attack power or crit, and since those on-hit bonuses aren't reflected by Nemean, it makes the item pretty hard to use. Though if crit becomes popular in ADC builds again, this item does become quite a bit better. Next up is Jade Scepter, which is a very underrated active item in my opinion. This comes with 80 intelligence and 200 max health, and the active knocks enemies away from you in a pretty large cone. Enemies hit by this also lose 25% strength and int for 4 seconds, and the cooldown is only 60. This item is used less frequently than it should be in my opinion, and it's very good for keeping vulnerable intelligence-based mid laners safe from jungle and solo dives in teamfights. This knocks very far away and can often completely save you from a dive on a much lower cooldown than relics like Beads, Aegis, or Combat Blink. Yes, you sacrifice an item slot and your damage will suffer a bit for buying this, but on gods like Zeus and Ra, it can be enormously helpful when being dived. Although this item is pretty heavily countered by displacement immunity from abilities like Thor or Loki's 3, so keep that in mind. Linnean Bow is next up, which is the newest active item in the game and comes with strength and attack speed with an active effect that fires an arrow that deals 110% of basic attack damage, travels through walls, and can crit. Enemies hit by the arrow are anti-healed 40% for 4 seconds, and the effect has a 40-second cooldown. As mentioned, this item is very new, so there's less data on if it's good or not, but looking at the item on paper, it doesn't seem great. The cooldown is pretty low and anti-heal is very valuable, but there are two main things that hold this back. Firstly, there are other anti-heal items in the game like Divine Ruin, Brawler's Beatstick, and Curse Tank that apply anti-heal pretty consistently almost all the time, whereas this only applies it for 4 seconds every 40 seconds, or 10% of the time, even if you use it immediately off of cooldown, so other anti-heal options are usually just better. The other thing holding this item back is that ADC builds have to be very optimized for damage to be competitive, and slotting this item in when the enemy has something like more pen, kin size, and more on hit effects, you're just going to suffer too much in a DPS department to justify going this item, so I would say it's rarely worth it. Next up is Lifebinder, which is one of the least used items in the game, but I do think it's a little underrated. This comes with intelligence, health, and health regen, and the active fires out a blast in a cone that deals damage and marks enemies hit for 6 seconds. The first allied god, including yourself, that damages a marked enemy will heal and shield themselves, consuming the mark. The cooldown is only 15 seconds on this, and kills or assists reduce it by 20%. The main thing that makes this item a little better than most people give it credit for is the cooldown. This is up a lot and can provide a very big health swing. However, the item is still not amazing by any means, it's just a bit better than it seems. Overall, it's still a pretty mid item, but you can see some use for it in solo lane for winning trades or in support for healing your allies, but ultimately it's not that great. Next up is Pendulum Blade though, which is quite a bit better in my opinion. This comes with strength and cooldown rate, and the active effect simply takes 3 seconds off of all your active ability cooldowns with a cooldown of 50. This is simple but effective in my opinion. It can save you or secure a kill in a pinch where you normally would be just short of having an ability up, and the cooldown of only 50 seconds is very attractive. This is up for most fights in the mid to late game, which is generally when it should be bought as well. Since the cooldown reduction is a flat value, it's more effective the lower your base cooldowns are, so as you get more ranks in your abilities to lower their cooldown and more cooldown rate in your build, this effect becomes better and better. 3 seconds off of a 15-second cooldown ability isn't a big deal, but 3 seconds off of a 6-second cooldown ability is literally half the cooldown and can be very powerful on a lot of ability-based strength scaling junglers like Thor, Loki, Susanoo, and others. Moving on to Pharaoh's Curse, which is another great active item, in fact one of the very few that's already been nerfed in the game. Most active items I've only seen buffs or no changes, but this one actually took a nerf pretty recently due to its high usage. This grants both kinds of protections and attack speed, with the active effect basically being Smite 1 horrific emblem, slowing all enemies in a large area around you and reducing their attack speed for 6 seconds on a 60-second cooldown. This cooldown used to be 40, which was nerfed fairly recently for good reason. This item is incredibly effective, mainly in solo lane builds, but even in some support builds you can make use of this as well. The slow lasting for 6 seconds can be lethal if used on gods with no movement ability or after burning their movement ability. Horrific emblem in Smite 1 was a 120-second cooldown, and this is still only 60. Super good item, even after the nerfs. Next up is Phoenix Feather, which got a new effect added to it and a buff recently that made it much more attractive. This grants magical protections and health, with the active effect healing you for a flat 300 plus 30% missing health while pulsing out a ring of fire around you that deals 10% max health damage to enemies hit. This does have a very long cooldown at 180 seconds, which is the main thing holding it back. 3 minutes is far too long for the item to be reliably up every fight in the late game, and it's more likely to be up once every 2 or 3 fights, which is a harder pill to swallow. That combined with anti-heal being pretty commonly built right now to counter the meta means that this item isn't as good as it seems on paper. However, it can still be useful as the heal is massive, and unless the enemy team have substantial anti-heal, this can absolutely save you and turn some fights. It's just hard to justify when your 3-minute cooldown can be almost completely negated by a bit of anti-heal on the enemy team. Speaking of negated by anti-heal though, next up is Rod of Asclepius, which functions similar to Smite 1 but with an additional active effect. This grants intelligence, health, and health regen with a passive that boosts nearby allied healing by 15%. The active effect removes and negates all anti-heal effects on yourself and nearby allies for 3 seconds on a 90-second cooldown. This is pretty much a must-buy on dedicated healers, especially those that heal in combat like Aphrodite, as you're much more likely to be anti-healed while in active combat compared to healing after you've disengaged. The effect is short at only 3 seconds, but just make sure to pop this right before you do your big heal ability and you're golden. Obviously, it's quite a niche item, but for healers, it is really good. Next up, we have one of the most interesting active items in the game, but also the literal least used item in the entire game, Scepter of Dominion. This comes with intelligence, health, mana, and mana regen with one of the most crazy active effects in the game. After a short delay, this will stasis all gods in the area for 2 seconds. Stasis effectively removes those gods from the game for the duration, as they can't move, act, or take damage. This item theoretically could be very powerful in the exact right scenario, like hitting most of the enemy team on a siege, allowing you to get a free Phoenix while they're frozen, or doing it on a Fire Giant attempt to either secure or steal it, but in practice, this item is just incredibly hard to use effectively, even with a high skill ceiling, high communication team. Even in pro play, this item has seen basically no use, so overall, I think it's just a bit too hard to use effectively, and unless you want to have a bit of fun with it, I wouldn't recommend buying this. Next up, we have Screeching Gargoyle, which is an item that's seen a fair bit of play so far and seems pretty good. This comes with magical protection and cooldown rate with an active effect that silences all enemies in a large cone in front of you for 2 seconds, and they lose 25% of both protections for 4 seconds with a cooldown of 90. This is a really powerful effect as it can completely shut down enemies' movement abilities or abilities in general, leaving them sitting ducks for your dive. It's mostly used on solo laners who use the base stats effectively. Chak is a great user of this as he can use it to stop enemies using movement abilities to avoid his ultimate. Simply gargoyle them before you ult, and the silence lasts long enough to guarantee that your ult hits for another silence, leaving ability users pretty helpless. Odin can do a similar thing to prevent enemies escaping his ultimate. There's quite a lot of applications for this item in my opinion, and I think it's definitely worth exploring on solo laners and even some supports. Next up though is Shield Splitter, which is another fairly new active item that's only been in the game for a little over a month. This comes with strength and both kinds of protections, and the active effect throws forward an axe that deals damage and stops at the first god hit, dealing damage, reducing any active shields on them by 50%, and you gain the shield reduced. This item is of course fairly niche as there aren't that many shield users in Smite 2 at the moment, but this can definitely find use against gods like Odin, Yamoja, and Geb, and against the Phantom Shell Relic. In those cases, it's worth picking up on bruiser junglers and solo laners in my opinion, but it is a pretty niche use. Next up is a super interesting one, and that's Staff of Mirrodin, which takes inspiration from Smite 1's original design for this item. It comes with intelligence and cooldown rate with an active effect that causes your next basic ability used to have no cooldown. The item in itself has a pretty long cooldown of 150 seconds, but the effect is very strong, so this makes sense. The item is actually not too popular, but there are some use cases where it can definitely be super strong, and the only thing that holds it back really are the high cost and long cooldown. 150 seconds is only going to be usable once every 2 or 3 fights, so you've really got to make a fight-winning play with this item for it to be worth it. That said, it is a ridiculously good effect and can find use on gods like Zeus, who can double detonate with this due to it no longer removing charges from targets in Smite 2. Baron Samedi can double 2 after hitting someone with his 3 for big healing and damage. Agni can get 2 big AoE stun bombs off you're using this with Noxious Fumes. There are absolutely some good use cases for this item, but it's a very all-in strategy with high risk and high reward. And you really need the play you make with this to be a high impact play, or you're just wasting an item slot with how long the cooldown is. It's a ton of fun to use regardless though, so definitely give it a try on some of your favorite intelligence mid laners or even elsewhere. Next up is Stampede, which is a really strong active item after some of the buffs it got in OB1. This comes with physical protections, health, and health regen, and the active effect grants a burst of decaying movement speed as well as attack speed and slow immunity to all nearby allies. It's basically Heavenly Wings from Smite 1, but also provides attack speed, and it's on a 60-second cooldown instead of 120 for Wings in Smite 1. This is super strong at the moment and is likely to get nerfed, but even still, it's a very powerful effect for getting your team into and out of fights, and the team-wide slow immunity is very valuable in certain matchups like against Cupid's ultimate, Sobek's ultimate, or mages using Gem of Isolation. It's a super good item built mainly on supports, but occasionally seen on solo laners as well. Definitely worth a buy even if the slow immunity isn't doing too much, and absolutely essential against heavy slow teams. Next up we have Sunbeam Bow, which is one of the most popular active items in the game at the moment, and for good reason. It's another toggle effect much like Eye of the Storm discussed earlier, and comes with strength, intelligence, attack speed, and mana regen. The active effect causes your basic attacks to shoot 2 extra small projectiles, 1 to each side, that deal 15 base plus 20% of your basic attack damage each. So a total of 30 plus 40% basic attack power. The downside here is that it drains 5% max mana per second while active, so you can't just have it constantly on or you'll be out of mana immediately. Well, with some exceptions like Yamoja and Thanatos who don't use mana, but they aren't particularly good with this item anyway, and it's more of a fun thing, not a meta build. On actual auto attackers though, like most hunters, this item is really good as it basically makes your auto attacks do 1.4 times damage while it's on, and that extra 40% is magical damage, which is really nice for hunters since they do physical damage and it's hard to build against against this build for tanks. This also sees some use on melee solo laners like Amaterasu and Bellona to give them extra wave clear, totem pressure, and boxing damage. Make sure to manage your mana when using this though, as it will drain very quickly, but with some mana regen on the item itself and some from other sources like dominance for ADCs, blue buff for solo laners, etc., this is a manageable cost for an extremely powerful effect. Absolutely worth using and currently part of the meta ADC build for Smite 2 alongside Braggy's Harp, another on-hit damage item. And our final active item is not only the most used active item in the game, it's probably the most used item in the game, period. That is of course Talisman of Purification. This grants magical protection, health, and cooldown rate with an active effect that cleanses CC on all nearby allies, including you, and makes them immune to CC for 1 second. This has a long cooldown of 180 seconds, but this item is just so insanely valuable in Smite 2 with the one relic system limiting defensive options. It's just bees for the whole team. That's obviously going to be powerful, and I won't be surprised to see this cooldown increased in the future, but for right now, it's really strong. It's an extra set of beads for backliners or a way for non-backliners to get access to beads without using their relic slot if they wanted to go something like Blink or Sunder or Shell. This is pretty much mandatory in support builds and is even picked up in solo a fair bit, especially against heavy CC teams. It completely destroys some abilities like Ares ultimate, Chak ultimate, Amaterasu ultimate. Basically any big ult with CC attached can be easily dealt with by using this active, since it applies to your whole team if they're reasonably close to you. Buy this every game in support, consider picking it up in solo, and you might even consider it on some mids and jungles if you're having trouble with hard CC, and can justify sacrificing some damage for this. It's one of, if not the best item in the game right now. But that's every Smite 2 active item, what they do, and some use cases for them. Hopefully this has helped you out to understand the system a bit more, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you guys buying these some more in your matches, because a lot of them go underused right now because people just aren't familiar with the system. The best way to get familiar is just to give them a shot, so have at it, and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.